especially thank you everyone for joining. It's awesome that we have such a big group. And I am going to be speaking on the sociology of addiction. Very excited to bring this potentially very different perspective to some of the work that you do. Some of it might be intuitive, might be, a little outside the box, but we'll get into it here. So I will start out by saying I am not a behavioral health professional. I'm not a frontline worker. I've never worked in healthcare. I am, as Una said, a medical sociologist. So I study society essentially, but I study how that affects mental and physical health. So these perspectives are extremely intertwined and they all work to understand addiction better. So sociology in general is the study of society. It's the study of the structure of a society. So it is different than psychology, which is another study of human behavior, but where psychology looks at individual differences and really zeroes into what makes an individual tick and all of their individual factors. Sociology is studying that at the societal level. So we're actually comparing groups. We're comparing one society to another. We're looking at the inner workings of those societies. So all of the systems within that society, the healthcare system, the criminal justice system, the educational system. We're looking at culture, the way of life, how people are behaving, the process of socialization, which means the process where you learn what is expected, what is normal in your society. And we get that from a lot of different angles, our family, media, etc. And so ultimately, we are looking at differences between groups. And so we'll talk about those factors that we're looking at to really find out something about that larger community or society. If we see a very big difference in the rate of addiction between this group versus another group, that's telling us something more about the big picture. So the reason that we are looking at addiction in relation to society is that addiction is often seen as an individual problem, and it's something that does affect individual people. But what we also see in all of the research done on kind of that broader level is that social conditions, the environment that we live in, both in our very immediate environment, our larger community, and then just being in the society that we live in, those conditions affect the prevalence of addiction and the harms of addiction. Meaning there is such a big difference between different locations and different groups that is a signal that there's something going on in that environment that's affecting addiction, even though it's an individual problem and even though it has the genetic links and the psychological factors. So in this way, sociology complements a psychological approach because it's looking at other factors that affect addiction. So the broader question that we are asking today is, how do those social structures affect relationships, affect our social institutions, and how do those institutions affect inequality, and how do all of those factors influence not only substance use, but recovery, relapse, and stigma. So looking at the phrase of addiction versus the diagnosis of substance use disorder. Addiction is a much broader concept, and it does include craving, a loss of control, continued use despite harm, which is similar to substance use disorder. But if we look at just addiction a little more broadly, the culture of a society determines how addiction is defined. It is defined in different ways. It's viewed in sometimes very different ways, and it's treated differently. And so part of looking at the sociological effects of addiction, we're looking not only society to society, but we're looking at one society over time. And when you see those differences, that shows just how much addiction as a concept is shaped by society. That's in contrast to substance use disorder, which is a medical diagnostic framework. And as we'll see, as we look at how addiction is viewed in society, this medical term and a diagnosis shows that there has been a shift culturally from addiction being solely a moral failure and somebody that's doing something bad, or they're a bad person, or they don't care about themselves and other people, to a chronic illness. And this is a huge shift, and it affects everything: how we are treating people that have addiction, how we are viewing them in terms of stigma. And so that's a huge part of that distinction. So looking at the DSM-5 definition, just for comparison, the phrase here is a problematic pattern of substance use leading to clinically significant impairment or distress. So this definition, this diagnosis, is not defined only by frequency or physical dependence or stress-related use. So that means that if you are a heavy drinker, you feel like you need to drink, you are super stressed out, so you turn to drugs or you smoke weed or something to chill out, you could be using a lot, but not necessarily fall into this clinical category. This is defined by continued use despite harm. So there's harms, they're piling up, you're continuing to use, you're not really holding it together very well, and you would like to quit because of this harm, but you can't, and it just keeps on spiraling. These are the DSM listed substances. We have alcohol, caffeine is on there, cannabis, hallucinogens, any inhalants, opioids, sedatives, hypnosis, anxiolysis, stimulants, which include all of those different stimulants, methamphetamines, cocaine. We have tobacco. Gambling disorder is not a substance, but interestingly, it's now included, and I might list examples of that. I just did some research on gambling disorder, and what happened with this is that there was so much research on how gambling disorder mirrored what was going on with substance use disorder in terms of what parts of the brain are activated, how addiction gets kickstarted, and there's also a lot of research on the social factors, the environmental, cultural factors with gambling disorder. So this is now grouped into this section of the DSM. And there are also references to different behavioral addictions, compulsions that are being studied, but they're not official SUD diagnoses, things like internet gaming. So that's another societal factor. Technology evolves, and we have all of these other types of things that can program us for addiction. The DSM criteria for addiction is pretty substantial. There's a lot of different boxes to check. And so you are using one or more substances, and you are, number one, trying to cut down, trying to stop using the substance, but you're unable to. And that ties into some of the theories of what's going on with people using or not being able to quit, falling into addiction. You are experiencing intense cravings or urges to use that substance. You need more of the substance to get that same effect. That's tolerance. So you have to take more and more and more. You then are developing withdrawal symptoms when you're not using the substance, which makes you use it again and again. You're spending more time getting, using, recovering from substances. And this is a big one, that it's not only taking over more time in someone's life, but also that it's taking up more space in someone's mind, and it is becoming that obsession. This can lead to neglecting responsibilities at home, work, or school because of substance use, continuing to use even when it causes relationship problems. So again, problems are piling up, use still continues. You start to give up important or desirable social and recreational activities due to substance use. You're starting to act in different ways that you wouldn't normally act in, which includes using substances in risky settings or doing things that are dangerous that, again, you might not do if you didn't have this addiction, and continuing to use despite it causing problems to your physical and your mental health. So this is the criteria where it becomes a disorder, according to how we are defining it here, where it is causing problems, you're not able to stop. So there's something going on there with the individual choice versus something that's going on biologically and even socially. So a couple of individual factors that are also linked to the social environment: impulsivity, compulsivity. So impulsivity means you're acting quickly, you're not thinking about the long-term consequences, and this has often been linked to initiating use. So you do something impulsively, you are continuing to do that, and that can lead to that escalation that could be a rapid escalation. Compulsivity is when now you're settled into this repetitive habitual behavior. So it's not something that's just a quick decision, like this is part of your life and it continues despite harm. So this aspect is more linked to relapse and the chronic patterns of use. So both of these are impacted not only by biology, because this is stuff that is going on in your brain, but also the social context. What is going on around you? We also have negative reinforcement related to the social context. Again, what's going on in your life, what's going on in broader society even. So substance use gets reinforced, it reduces distress. So you are continuing to use it because it is, at least in the moment, and while you're high, it could reduce your distress. This could be from social withdrawal. You could be reducing your anxiety, emotional pain, your social stress. This could be related to work, economics, and it's removing unpleasant feelings. So the use increases. And the note here is that that reinforcement, where you're getting something out of it, and so you're using it again to get that same result, it's not only neurobiological, but it's influenced by the outside. Stress, trauma, isolation. Social isolation is one of the absolute worst things for your health. It is worse than heavily smoking, drinking alcoholically, being obese. All of these things are not even as impactful as social isolation when you look at the research on the individual link between social isolation and mortality. So this is something that affects people in a very, very influential way. You've got instability. This could be economic instability, housing instability, hopelessness. And so this helps to explain why addiction rates are different according to the environments people live in. So a little bit on the history. This is very interesting stuff because it shows how much culturally our views on addiction change over time. So rewinding way, way, way back, the origin of addict as a word is the Latin word addicere, I may be pronouncing that wrong, meaning given over to or bound to something. So it also signified being very, very devoted to something. It also meant to surrender to something. So you are giving up your life essentially to something. And this word also was the word for, or also meant being legally bound to someone. So again, that theme of you're giving yourself up to something else. And in the 16th all the way through the 18th century, it was also kind of used as a positive thing because it's referring to doing something very habitually, having a lot of dedication to something. So if you're, for example, reading scriptures from early morning to night, or you are meditating, the whole entire day, or you are super dedicated to some work and you can't stop, it's taking over your life. That's not necessarily viewed as a negative thing. That's what that signified. Now, fast forwarding to the 19th century, then it starts to be viewed as a moral failure, as being deviant from society. Deviance doesn't necessarily mean doing something bad according to society, but it means you're breaking the norm. So you're acting in a way that is not how people are supposed to act in society. So that is something that you're doing that's essentially wrong. Then it turns into a disease, and this is different across different societies, but in some societies, it goes to a disease, and that reflects medicalization. So some kind of behavior is then medicalized. And this happens with a lot of different behaviors and conditions where something becomes medicalized, it becomes something that can be diagnosed and then treated. So the theme that kind of shifts and changes is centered on the idea of agency, where technically you have agency. Technically, it's you purchasing the drugs or using the alcohol. You are making those decisions independently. It's not something where you are forced to use something. However, there's also this phenomena going on where you don't have a choice. And this is something really in the not only the big picture, but at the individual level. It's something that is very hard to understand if you haven't suffered from addiction, because it's hard to explain the idea of doing something that you don't want to be doing and just needing to do that. So you're causing harm, and it's like, why are you still making those choices? And the person is doing it themselves, but doesn't want to. So there's some kind of tension that's going on there. Now, still in the history, going even further back to the psychoactive revolution, this whole era highlights how much things change when you look at the individual substances and how they are viewed in society. So back in the 1400s through the 1500s, you have the expansion of global trade. So that means you have some substances that were accessible in one society, but another society didn't have them. And this is kind of like a social experiment. Like when you're looking at the sociological level, the societal level, and you're looking across history and different things are happening, different whole huge changes in how society is set up or what we do for work, you can kind of see what this experiment is showing us. So you are basically introducing substances into certain areas of the world. So some of these things included sugar, tobacco, opium, alcohol, and in general, you also see changes where the psychoactive substances are going from being used medicinally, being used in a religious way, to recreational use, where you're now using it for fun and for entertainment, and commercial use. Commercial use is a huge factor in addiction at the societal level. So this piece is very, very important. The fact that these substances were made into businesses and traded, which seems totally normal. Like there's nothing strange about that. You're going to sell goods, obviously. However, with these substances, you see an impact on the society when they are introduced with a very, very wide range. So some of the societal consequences or how the societies adapted to these substances are as follows. And I'm picking and choosing just different examples to show the contrast. So in the 1600s, you have some countries that imposed extremely harsh penalties for tobacco. obviously that contrasts to our society where we have it as a huge industry. It's seen as fine for your health. You have doctors that are smoking. There were even cigarettes for asthma. Now we have a lot of restrictions on tobacco use. It's still somewhat socially acceptable. But these countries, there was sometimes even the penalty of death for having tobacco. So that's a huge contrast. 1700s, you have alcohol heavily impacting Native communities throughout colonization. So this is happening across history, but there was a significant impact when alcohol was introduced. And again, you've got biological and genetic factors going on. You have sociological factors going on where this really kind of takes over and really harmed Native communities. That happens still today. In the 1800s, cocaine, and we're talking same exact cocaine back then as we do have today, and it was promoted as a treatment for alcohol, promoted as a treatment also for morphine dependence, and also used for toothaches, particularly for children. So this is a contrast too, where you have something that's integrated into daily life. It's something that, as you can see with the advertisement, which is obviously very interesting to take a look at this because this was a real advertisement. 15 cents to me sounds kind of expensive for back then, but not sure about that. And it says for sale by all druggists. So this is something that is totally accessible if you have 15 cents. It's used in a way that's positive as a treatment. And then, of course, it becomes something that is super harmful to communities. So why is that? Why was it used that way? And there wasn't a huge public health crisis, and now it is. So we have then in the 1900s, the temperance movements, and these started actually well before prohibition. So you've got temperance movements that are now linking substance use with morality, with religion. You kind of have those trends of the wives that are, doing, and it was a women-led movement to be able to try to do prohibition. And obviously that was successful in the fact that it happened, not successful in the fact that it ended up being kind of repealed and there was still kind of the underground markets for that. But nonetheless, we're starting to look at substances as bad, as needing to be regulated and tied with religion, tied with family values, etc. So taken together, we're seeing that the culture, the time period, the country is defining how things are normalized, what is normal in society. And by that, I mean what is socially accepted, what is seen as not causing harm to a society. We have commercialization where there is a profit motive. We've got medicalization going on, and then we have moral panic around substances. Totally different responses. Here is another illustration. This is from 1846. And here we have an image of how alcohol was then viewed in society. So you start from the left. I'll just go over this a little bit. You might not be able to read this kind of fine print, but you start out with having a glass of wine with a friend. Then you take a glass to keep the cold out. So now it's like something that is helping you. A glass too much, you're kind of over drinking. Drunk and riotous, you're kind of getting out of control, maybe starting fights in a bar. Then you reach kind of this pinnacle where it says jolly companions, a confirmed drunkard. So I would say in present day, this would be somebody that like parties a lot, basically says that they are an alcoholic, but is not planning on quitting. And kind of that is just their lifestyle. Now you move going down the steps to poverty and disease. Now the effects are really starting to kick in. Then you have forsaken by friends. So you are getting more and more on the outskirts, probably drinking alone. Then there's desperation and crime, where you're doing things you don't want to do. And then finally, at the end, it says death by suicide. So we could look at that as overdoses or what have you. But you can see how even in 1846, it's almost kind of like mirroring this progression and overlapping some with the DSM-5. So it goes to show kind of how things were interpreted, only in this sense, where you have the woman and her child underneath it. In this sense, it is really presented as a moral failing. Like these people are entering into this cycle, and even we can see it overlaying our perspective that this is a progression of alcoholism, and this is something that is diagnosable around step 6. But you also see that just this image shows that it's looked at as someone who is just engaging progressively in worse and worse behavior. So now that we have kind of this historical perspective where we see just how much the culture of a society is affecting how things are seen, we'll get into social factors. And this is something that we're talking about present day. We're talking about the research that shows some of these group differences. So to define social factors, these are part of someone's social environment. They are measured at the individual level, but they're based on group differences. So this also kind of explains how sociological research is different than psychological research. And obviously there's a lot of overlap. It's not to say that there aren't social factors in psychological research. That's really some of the bulk of what I review as far as research, because it's combining those things. But when we kind of categorize people, we're categorizing people into groups based on some of these things that I'll go over on the right-hand side. And very importantly, it's not to say that people that are in that same group, you're the same race as we define it in society, or the same age. It's not to say that you are even very similar to people in that group that you're a part of. It's to identify if there's something about that category in society that could be related to, in this case, addiction. So in other words, if we see a very big difference when we compare groups by race, that's not telling us that people inside that group are similar. That's telling us that there's something about our society where we're living in a society where there is that difference, because not every society will see differences in addiction by certain groups. So we're categorizing people. We're careful not to stereotype people. We're careful not to take the group differences and then apply it to an individual person, because an individual person might be in a category that might have a higher risk of addiction and not struggle with addiction at all. So we're really using this to look at the community level. And that's really important, because that's where we're going to point our resources to addressing the issue if we want to go upstream and look at some of these aspects of a social environment. So we know through research that they do influence an individual's risk for substance use and addiction and recovery and access to treatment. We're not saying that everyone in these groups does, but if you look at, for example, age and gender, there's differences on initiation of substances, there's differences on addiction rates, on overdose rates, by age, by gender, by sexuality. There are differences in terms of the harms of addiction and substance use by race and ethnicity. Again, those differences, we could see a different pattern in one society versus the other society. You have socioeconomic status, which is a measure that is a combination of your wealth, your job and the prestige of your job, your income, your education. All of that goes into basically placing you on a socioeconomic ladder in society. And pretty much in all conditions, you are going to see that gradient. Your family environment, the substance use around your peers, you have trauma and your ACE scores, your adverse childhood experiences, whereas those pile up, that sets you on a different trajectory in terms of your risk for addiction and pretty much all other social conditions and mental health conditions. Social isolation, I mentioned, is a huge factor. You've got housing and employment instability, so comparing people that have stable housing versus not. Also with access to healthcare, access to treatment, people that have access versus people who do not, people who have social support and connection versus do not, and all the spectrum in between. The research is comparing those groups and also controlling for all the other factors and variables that we have access to that we can add into that research so that we can pinpoint, do things like housing or access to treatment actually have an influence on addiction, or is it really other factors that overlap with that? Now, going to our structural factors. Structural factors and social factors are often intertwined and interchangeable. And even over the years, I've had a hard time really distinguishing them because there is so much overlap, and even the words that we use and the measures are similar. But had kind of a click the other day where it's really about where they're measured. It is, because the social factors are grouping individuals, and the structural factors are really characteristics of the community itself. So it's the same type of thing. We're still looking at basically the same factors that we would if we're looking at the differences between those groups and what it means to have a certain race in society or have a certain sexuality in society. Now we're looking at the society itself. So all of those systems that make up society, those are the characteristics of the society. It's like the body parts, if you're looking at physical health, it's like the mental and neurobiological factors when you look at psychological health. Now, if you're looking at the health of a society, you're looking at the society's systems, the society's body parts. So again, those are things like the educational system, the healthcare system, the criminal justice system, politics, how the government is structured, the economy, the industries in a certain society, the technology and the technological changes, religion, how families are structured, the physical infrastructure of society, the transportation system, literally all of the building blocks you could think of in a society. And it's a little bit abstract to think about that, but you can kind of envision a society and the buildings and the services. And so when we look at structural factors, we are taking in data. It's like a society filling out a survey. And what's your healthcare system like? And how is it set up? So those are the societal level conditions, but they can be measured at the country level. They can be measured at the state level. They can be measured at the neighborhood level. You can use census tract data, and they can also be measured in a smaller community. So what are the things that we could measure? And specifically, what are the structural factors that we know for sure affect rates of addiction? So just to kind of tie it back to this distinction between individual and social and societal, we have the individual factors, understanding what brought that person to addiction or what factors are at play if we want to understand that more. Then we have the differences between groups to understand if there is an influence of that outside environment due to these, you could call it social labels too. And now we're looking at differences at the societal level, not individual differences, not group differences, but societal differences. And the truth is, these addiction rates vary, widely across communities. And so when we're trying to explain why this community over here has a huge opioid problem, this community over here also has access to opioids, but does not have a problem that is escalated. Why is that? So you can look at things like poverty and inequality. They're two different things. If one community is a high poverty area or slides into poverty because there may be something that happened in that community, like let's say a factory that employed the majority of the people in that community has mass layoffs or shuts down entirely, you're going to have then the spread of poverty. And you can think about this as a petri dish. And what is the culture? I guess pun intended. And what is happening in that petri dish that can breed addiction? So one society, the same people living in that society, and it is very different. So you've got poverty as a evidence-based impact on addiction. That's a structural factor. You have inequality. There's something about inequality which is measurable. It's like you can measure it by, what's the difference between the top 10% of a society and the bottom 10% in terms of income. How much more does the top 10% make than the bottom 10%? Or, kind of figure that out as far as the ratio of the high income to the low income. And that ratio is very different across society. Some it's pretty squeezed in. Ours is just about the most dramatic of any society when we look at the concentration of wealth. And there's something about inequality that doesn't just affect people that may be on the lower end in terms of income or access to resources. It actually affects everybody in society, because that is linked to not only addiction, but a very wide range of social problems. The countries that have more inequality have more social problems. And you can control for other factors and you still see that pattern. Because in sociology, we are looking at, think about a map that has hotspots, like a meteorological map, like for the weather. You see those weather patterns. This is what we're looking at. We're looking at, geographical areas, and there are hotspots of addiction and other social problems. So some of those hotspots line up with poverty and line up with inequality in a society. Even if you have a high income country, even if you have a high GDP country, we hear about that in the media, where there's a high GDP, our economy is doing well. Well, that's not actually an indicator of the economic situation of the people in that society. And it's not an indicator, but factors into measuring the intensity of inequality. So that's another structural factor, again, related to addiction. Housing instability is a huge one. And this might be intuitive. Many of you probably live in communities where there might be housing issues. There might be issues with homelessness and people that do not have shelter. And that could be a growing problem in your community. And, we might put it together that instability is related to mental health issues, but sometimes people look at it in the reverse, where you're thinking that it's mental health issues that are leading towards that situation. And there is a link there. If you really rewind the clock back to when our, mental hospitals were shut down, and then that's kind of the birth of that homelessness issue, because then people have kind of nowhere to go. And so there were ethical issues with those hospitals, but then you have kind of the unintended consequence here. So there's a mental health connection there, but there's also the reverse. And again, we're looking at the community level. So we're looking at a community that has housing instability versus one that has stable housing, and the difference between addiction rates or rates of overdose, drug poisoning, etc. Healthcare access is another issue. There are some areas like rural areas, which again, some of you may live in rural areas, you know that people may have to drive a very, very far amount to get to any kind of healthcare, let alone treatment services. So that is an issue with these problems starting to get greater and greater when it affects a society. Criminal justice policy. This is really big. It affects who will go to jail for certain substances. It affects who might be on a route to treatment or not. It also affects the stigma around it, which affects mental health, which affects use of substances. There's also racism and discrimination. This trickles down to people's mental health. Even if somebody does not buy into the fact that there are certain races that are better than others, and you're totally against that, and you know that's not true, if that is in the mix in your society, it does affect individuals. Discrimination does affect individuals' mental health, and it also affects policy. It also affects economics. It affects what neighborhoods and places get resources. It's all in the mix for that destabilization of a community. The unemployment rate, this is, again, tying it to that example of a factory closing. Now people have unemployment. Now people don't have a sense of purpose. People don't have a paycheck. And so that can really decimate a society. And when you see two societies, for example, that both have that happen, because there could be a company that's going offshore and they're closing the companies in the US and in Sweden. But the policies that underlie those types of issues are so different that you see not only a huge deviation in the risk of addiction, but you also might not see that risk at all in a society that has supports. Got a society in America where there's not as much of a cushion if you lose your income. And then you have other societies where there's resources to go back to school. There's more of a pathway. You can still live a very comfortable life. And now you're in transition and you're actually getting supported to potentially go in a different direction and have time off of work. Like, those community factors are literally the environments that birth some of these addiction issues that become public health problems. Drug policy that goes along with the criminal justice policy and what's available, what is accessible in terms of getting drugs in general. And then you have availability of treatment, which overlaps with healthcare access, but we know that treatment is not always widely available. If there's something like telehealth, where we think now it's available to everybody, well, there are still huge swaths of places that don't have broadband internet, people that don't have access to computers. So there's still very large portions of society that don't even have access to the resources. So we're talking about kind of the three-pronged access to substances, use of substances, addiction issues, and then treatment recovery. So now we'll move on to social theory. Now, it's very common to say that sociology might be too theoretical. I've spent my career kind of showing that it's actually not too theoretical, and that really this is a perspective that then guides research. And when we have research on these, we can better divert resources to things that will actually address some of these issues at the population level. And understanding how systems work is really influential. Who knows? There might be someone in the audience that has a sociology background and then went into psychology. That's a great combination. You're seeing the big picture, you're seeing what these social forces are, and then you're actually in a position where you can make a difference and you have those perspectives tied together. So social theory, like any theory, is used to both analyze and explain how different variables affect your outcome. So in this case, with social theory, we're looking at how social forces influence people and society. So having the theory, which basically just means you have the idea that this might be linked to that. The idea has to come up, and then that can be used to help researchers, clinicians, policymakers understand these patterns of behavior at the psychological level, but also at the community level, and be able to understand patterns of social problems. Because again, it's not something that is spread evenly in society. It's something that there are these hotspots. So we want to know why. And so we start with that theory, that idea, to develop a framework that we can use and how we can measure things. And we can study things like stigma from society to society. We can study norms, we can study inequality and power and how that all affects addiction. So looking at the early sociological theory, as you can tell, I appreciate looking at history. Oftentimes, this is a sidebar, but oftentimes in sociology and just in society, we compare how it is now to, say, the 1950s and how things have changed. Well, for one, in the 1950s, even if we think about, there was the nuclear family and the wife was at home, the husband was at work, and there were kids in the house, that only accounts for about 60% of households even in that era. There actually was a lot of variation. And also that time period really stuck out in society. That was very different than the 30s, the 40s. So it is really important to look at the history instead of comparing in a smaller window, especially when it comes to these general theories on what addiction even is. Bringing those types of perspectives to an individual person can really take away from it being so much tied to the individual and see kind of how this problem has evolved in society. So going back to one of the earliest sociological theorists, Alfred Linsmith, he proposed the idea that addiction was linked to avoiding withdrawal. So it's linked to something where you are suffering and then you're reaching for that to help you. Using substances for physical and emotional pain. Again, using it for a specific reason and getting a specific outcome, where that is very different than somebody that is doing that because they love it and they're selfish and they want to feel good and they might be kind of a sketchy person. This is something different where we're looking at someone that is basically suffering and they're trying to feel better. So in this perspective, continued use really depends on how people are experiencing and interpreting withdrawal. And that is coming into play there. So it's then, again, challenging the moral explanations of addiction, where literally the explanation is this person is just screwing up and they're affecting people negatively and they should be removed from society. And it is for sure their fault, versus it framing addiction in a totally different way, in a non-individual way, where it's shaped by your social experience, not just your individual choices, but what is going on around you. Again, if you are seeking relief from physical or emotional pain, where is that stemming from? It doesn't fully explain relapse or long-term addiction patterns, and it wasn't really meant to, but this quote really sums up this shift in thinking. Far from being freed from his problems, he is actually one of the most obviously worried and miserable creatures in our society. This is obviously gendered as it was, as something that was more of a male problem. But this quote says that instead of using this and then being freed, you are stuck in this loop and you are suffering. So it's kind of taking a step towards this being more of a disease that someone is afflicted with, versus something that is just a conscious choice. And this brings up this debate of, is it non-voluntary or voluntary? And that's how it's phrased. So a non-voluntary view means that addiction is a condition and it is shaped by that withdrawal and that compulsion and that loss of control. So they are, meaning people that are struggling with addiction, are not just choosing that voluntarily. They are stuck in something where they don't have control. They're doing it almost kind of feeling like it's against their will. Then you have the voluntary view, which is that you are doing it voluntarily. You are making that choice. It is a response to social pressures. So there's still that external environmental impact. So you're coping with your social roles, which that was a big one in COVID, where you had too many roles, too many expectations. A lot of people fell into addiction in that era. Social isolation, rejection, marginalization. So you have the social context. We're still in sociology here, but you're using it for a purpose and you are deciding to do that. You are not in a situation where you are completely losing control and have lost all control. So there is kind of this idea with the voluntary view that you are still in control, even at the level of the addict. Stigma and culture are influencing the perception of this. Literally how it's looked at in society and what we're taught influences whether in society, and obviously there's huge variation within a society. We're not saying that everybody thinks this way, because again, this is a structural factor. Doesn't mean every single person in that group in society feels that way, but this goes into the debate of, is this a moral issue? Is it a medical issue? And this comes into play with individuals struggling with addiction and how their family views it. Does their family view it as a moral issue? So then we have the modern clinical diagnosis, which falls into the category of non-voluntary, falls into within the medical model. It does shift from a purely moral issue to considering the social context with this theoretical model. And it also shows that in our current day, we are choosing the non-voluntary. So now I'm going to talk about the 3 sociological theoretical frameworks. So again, these are ideas. And the interesting thing about sociology is that really we have 3 schools of thought. I don't see it that way. I see it as 3 angles from which to see something, and we want all of those angles. We don't want to debate which is the right way to look at it, because all of them are at play. But all of the additional theories, and every time somebody does sociological research, that theory on what's going to happen in that study can be traced back to these original frameworks. And I will also say, again, kind of bringing up the 2 theoretical idea, is that these theories then are added to the psychological theories and the genetic biological theories. Now you have even more angles from which to see the problem. And of course, we're not just looking at this as understanding how to help an individual. We're looking at this more of, you could say, a public health level. Why is this going on? Why is this exploding in certain societies? So the 3 perspectives are symbolic interactionism, where this is about what things mean. It's about what the labels mean, how our social interactions and how our interactions with our society through things like media are shaping substance use, because they do. So again, this is tied to how things are viewed. Then you have the functionalist approach. Functionalism, or structural functionalism, is looking at the impact of social institutions, all of those systems, healthcare, education, religion, all of those. It's looking at that impact and how those institutions affect each other. So there could be something going on in the healthcare system that's now affecting the public health system, which is then affecting the healthcare system. All of those things are intertwined. So it's looking at the structure of society, the stability of society, and we can study that in relation to addiction rates. It also looks at the social functions of social problems. So this gets really interesting because basically it's saying that if this problem is persisting in society, it must be providing some kind of function. It's kind of like when the substance use persists in an individual, it must be giving them something. Maybe it's relief from physical and emotional pain. So it's looking at, if its focus is addiction, what is that giving in society? If it weren't for addiction, there wouldn't be treatment programs, there wouldn't be that industry, there wouldn't necessarily be the moral and the stigma around it. It might be providing a function for advocacy to address addiction. There are certain, and it's kind of awkward to say because it almost seems like there's a positive to that, like poverty. There's a function of, well, it wouldn't be able to be used in political debates and as kind of a political pawn. So looking at what it serves in society. Then conflict theory essentially looks at power inequality, disadvantage, and how that affects addiction risk and outcome. So who has the power? That explains why things are the way they are. So we'll dig deeper into these different perspectives. Starting with symbolic interactionism. So again, this is about the perceptions of drugs, and through social interaction, we're learning what those perceptions are. So the influence of the social environment, the influence of norms in society, and that makes sense. If it's totally the norm to smoke weed in your community or in your family, where maybe it's a community where the main industry is cannabis. And so it is part of the culture. It is part of how people make their income and can live their lives. So if you're growing up where everybody is using that and it's very normal, you're more likely to use it. You're more likely to see it as something that's not bad, and that could lead to addiction. There's also this idea of the navigation of two identities. So this is labels coming from the outside, but also labels that you are then internalizing. So you, as an addict, you could have this identity of being an addict versus a non-addict, being an addict versus a sober person, an alcoholic. Like all of these labels can affect the continued use of substances, or if you choose to get treatment. So there's this concept of the emotionally divided self. So you have that inner conflict. And an example of that might be, let's look at when weed became legal. So you could be using, it is illegal. You think on the one hand, this is not bad. Maybe you're not an addict. Maybe you are, this is normal, maybe within your friend group, and it's something that helps you. Maybe you think it expands your perspective. It gives you relief. You have epiphanies, you're creative, whatever you're perceiving as the behavior in terms of if it's right or wrong. You could have one side of yourself that thinks it is a good thing, literally, but then you could have this other side because of internalizing the labels in society where it is bad and you go to jail for it and it's wrong. And there's that much of a legal issue with it. You've got that going on too, because you live in the society where it is labeled like that. So then you're kind of going back and forth, and that can cause a lot of inner conflict. You can also be using because you are interpreting the cost benefit, where this is the best possible alternative versus just struggling with these issues. I could easily get relief if I used weed, or if I took opiates, or if I drank. So you're seeing it as something that is going to be better than whatever you're dealing with at the time. So symbolic interactionism is about these perceptions and attitudes. And of course, it ties into the public and personal attitudes on if it's voluntary or not. Another part of symbolic interactionism that's interesting and is kind of a continuation of looking at those different societies over time when certain substances got introduced. So the same behavior we know can be seen differently, but it can be seen differently depending on the setting. So the setting, meaning like the immediate environment. It can be seen as safe versus unsafe. Of course, it's legal versus illegal. Substances are socially labeled as soft drugs or hard drugs. And this is also related to whether it's seen as a choice or loss of control. So it's like if you're using the soft drugs, you're just, you're doing it, you're in control. You might be smoking weed every day. It's not a problem in terms of the perception. It's seen as something that's more soft versus when you get into hard drugs. Okay, now you're on heroin. Now you're really caught in it. And so there can be a view of like, once you step into that, or it's heroin or it's meth, like then you are, the perception is that you're not really choosing to do it and you're really getting into addiction. So present day in our society here, the medical labels often are dominating how we're seeing it. But people's individual experiences are really influenced by social meaning and environment. And this can be tied to recovery, by the way. There's a whole other, section of this issue of the social environment of the meanings, where people often have to migrate from a drug culture to a recovery culture, and they're leaving all of their relationships behind. So you have to somehow replace that with something else as far as their view, their spiritual view, their social life, all of that. So perceived as safe. These are just examples of that. You've got your supervised drug consumption sites. So in some countries, there's literally like overdose and prevention rooms where you are using drugs there. Hospital settings, of course, where you're prescribed drugs. You've got your clinical treatment programs, could be a methadone program, private trusted social settings. So if you're using drugs or alcohol, like, at a friend's house, that's perceived as safe, even though obviously you could overdrink and it could be very unsafe. Legal regulated environments. So, you're in a bar, there's security, you can be in a therapeutic setting, controlled dosing. We have that in Oregon now with psilocybin, where you're using psilocybin in a therapy room. That's seen very differently as another environment. So environments that perceive drug use inside that environment as unsafe or risky. Public spaces in a street, a park, an alleyway, even somebody that is just drinking on the street. That is often perceived as something that is unsafe versus somebody that may be drinking just as much at a private party. An unregulated party environment, a rave, a festival, without harm reduction access. So again, you could be doing the same amount of psilocybin. You're at a music festival versus you're in a therapy room. Same thing, different environment. Something like an unknown social setting. So you're using with strangers, you meet people on the street, people that you don't know. Now you're using the same thing, but it's this unknown setting. So that's perceived more as risky. Illegal market context. So you're buying things on the street. You don't know if it's pure or not. This is very dangerous. High policing environments. So if you are scared of being arrested, you're hiding your use, that's perceived as more risky. You have social isolation with your use, where you're using alone, that's going to increase your overdose risk as well. If you are in a violent or instability prone neighborhood, again, same amount of use, same substance, different settings, different perception. And that perception can affect that individual person as well. Now moving towards functionalism. So functionalism, we are thinking about the social structure. So this is, of course, looking at institutions, looking at social norms and how the social roles that you have influence substance use. Again, if you are, you know, during COVID, you had a lot of what we call role strain, where you might be, a mother and also a teacher and also a executive that's working from home. And there's so much pressure there that we did see spikes in substance use. Huge spikes in opioid use during that time. So again, that is a societal factor bearing down on individuals, having to do with social roles. You can also have social anomie, which means there aren't norms. There can even be normlessness. So if a society is super, super structured where everybody knows what they need to do and it's very just laid out, that's very different than when there isn't a lot of norms and people kind of do whatever they want. Strain theory is a major theory that stemmed from functionalism, where your substance use and abuse and addiction is tied to the discrepancy or the match with how society defines success. So your status, your income, what you're doing, and then your ability to meet that and how that contributes to substance use. This I really wanted to share, but it would take way too long to tell you about. So there is a handout that you should have of this. So you can read this later on. I'm just going to tell you what it is. So basically you have in the first column, well, the very first column, you have the adaptation style, which means you're adapting to, in your society, the cultural goals, let's say college, job, marriage, kids, house, whatever it may be, and then your access or your means to achieve that. And all of these examples of drug use and abuse and addiction are being tied to this framework. So all of these different things on the side, conformity, innovation, ritualism, retreatism, rebellion, those are different categories that you might fit in based on your acceptance of that, let's call it the American dream, or rejection, and then your ability to get that, or your lack of ability. So these examples are just really interesting. So definitely glad that you have it. So you have, for example, just to pick out a little bit, if you accept the goals and accept the means, you could be using, but it's socially acceptable. If you accept the goals, but you reject or lack access to means, you're going to do something different. So maybe you want to have the American dream, but you're going to sell drugs to get there. You've got ritualism, where you're rejecting, you do not care about the American dream, but you're still doing the things that are expected in society. So you could, it's kind of like every day is exactly the same. So you're using every day and you don't really care about, meeting those goals, but you're not really doing something that's way outside of society. Then you have retreatism, where you reject the societal goals, but you also reject or lack access to the means. So that means you don't have the means, you don't want the goals. So then you're kind of you're pulling away. So you don't really care about those expectations. You don't really care. So you could withdraw and you could get, severe dependence on substances like opioids and not really be connected to kind of like the outside world. And then you have rebellion, where you reject the societal goals. You do not care about the American dream. You do not care about capitalism. You're against that. But then you're seeking to replace them with something. So you still want to work towards a dream. So you could be in a countercultural movement. You could be in a cult with certain values that are different than broader society. So your drug use could be part of an identity connected to that. All right, you can read the rest. So in functionalism, we also have this role of institutions. So you've got the media, how that influences norms, the visibility, your attitudes. You have the medical system, which defines what is the right treatment, what is the diagnosis. You've got your corporations marketing substances. You've got religion. Is it moral? Is it something that's more behavioral? You have the government. So this is just kind of a repeat of the effect of society. And again, you've got heroin over here. You could buy that in Sears Warburg catalog, very different now. Conflict theory, lastly, focuses on power, inequality, disadvantage. And so this means that why is this the way that it is? Well, it's because these people over here want it to be that way, and they have the power. Period, end of sentence. That's how things are viewed in this framework. So you've got pharmaceutical companies, they're aggressively marketing. So that's why it increased dramatically in economically struggling regions. They were targeted. You have gambling machines more prevalent in low-income areas. You have gambling apps that are really specifically made to the T to get people to continue to use it and not stop. Why is it the way that it is? Why do we have a huge spike in gambling disorder? Well, it's because people in power are developing this and they're selling it, and that's an explanation. The social media apps, they're designed to keep your attention. So we basically say addiction is not distributed equally. There are hotspots in different places, and that is because there are industries or people or groups that have the power that are benefiting off it being like that in those areas. So a couple more examples. Of course, you have the corporate interest. This is one of the biggest ones. So it's profit driven. So there's a lot of effort in getting people to use opioids. Same with the tobacco industries. So that's a huge factor. You've got government power again. This falls into conflict theory because it shapes who's criminalized, who's treated. You have differences in cocaine and crack in terms of the penalty and criminal justice system. That was changed a little bit under Obama, but that's affecting people. You've got your structural inequality again, your differences in status, your differences in the resources that you have. None of that is equally spread out in societies. So when you have those areas that have lack of resources, that is going to breed more addiction. Again, even though it's an individual thing. Marginalization, again, those unequal penalties, that reflects the social hierarchy, what race is dominating, and that's a very real thing. And we're seeing that reflected now in society with how our government is and how our messages are. And there's really specific messages around some of this stuff. Another issue within this perspective is dislocation and poverty. So not just the poverty of the lack of economic resources, but actually the poverty of the culture itself being lost. So again, this is like a social experiment when you have people that through war, through colonization, get literally moved. Native Americans literally moved to a different area. You obviously see this in the world today, but throughout history, if that group gets moved and their culture starts deteriorating and that cohesion in their own sub-society, that has been linked to addiction issues at the level of what we would call a public health crisis. Opium wars in China. Anything that is increasing your exposure or it's increasing your risk, because all of that in the society that could be protective, especially like culture and spirituality and connection. And then you have this huge shift that is a factor that, again, throughout society has been linked to increases in addiction. And we don't necessarily talk about that now, but it is something that there's a lot of evidence for all of these issues to kind of point to. So now that we've covered the social factors, the structural factors, all of the theory behind it, now we tie it together in terms of the intervention side. So multi-level theory means we have all those different theories. biological, genetic, psychological, social, structural. It's important to combine all of them. Again, that's definitely my perspective. We're not trying to figure out which theory and which thing to necessarily pinpoint. So when we combine all of those, we have multi-level interventions. So a multi-level intervention integrates things like neurobiology and genetics, things like on the psychological side, addressing issues related to cognition, to trauma, coping, emotional regulation. Then on the social side, you're integrating relationships, you're integrating culture and things that are culturally appropriate and align with the people that are part of that intervention, social networks, building up that social support. And then with structural factors, if we want to reduce the rate of addiction and work on that problem, if you're not addressing basic needs in society, food, shelter, water, connection, good luck. Because that foundation of society affects all the different social problems that pop up. So we're really addressing things at the individual level, maybe the community level, but these types of things are part of interventions. So if we address inequality, poverty, policy, access to care, we will see an impact. So some examples of this are housing first. So look for the different theories and perspectives in there. You have stable housing, plus you have clinical care and social services. You have medication-assisted treatment, medication with counseling, with peer support, with care coordination, with healthcare and social services. Then you have drug courts. That's part of that criminal justice system, but you have treatment-based alternatives to incarceration with legal supervision, with support services. You've got harm reduction. Let's say you are not really able to get a handle on this individually, and people are using anyway, and people are not migrating towards treatment, or treatment is not available. So you have syringe exchanges, you have naloxone distribution, where people are at least prepared to prevent overdose. You have mobile outreach, where you are going to people. So it's something that then, what are you addressing? You're addressing the access to care. You could be giving referrals in different environments. You could be prepared to give referrals. Then you have the school and family-based programs. So those are programs that might combine education, family involvement, anything that's at the community level that integrates the social level, but also it's going further upstream to provide that education and to provide resources on that level in local communities. So tying all this together with some final thoughts. The biggest take-home message is that addiction is shaped by both individual experience and the social context. And this, I believe, can be very powerful in the one-on-one setting, in therapy, in counseling, bringing this information actually to the individual, that not only are they not alone, but there are certain forces that are breeding this, and that it is becoming normal for certain reasons that are outside the individual. And so they are part of a group that is being affected by some of this, by the economics, by the political issues, by things like poverty and discrimination, that those things affect people, that it's not just them and they're broken and they can't stop, that it is part of a bigger picture. It's not placing blame on something else. It just relieves some of that pressure so that you have a broader perspective of it. And then it can even be seen as really fighting against some of those issues. And you can develop an identity where it's, you're moved to engage in prevention and have that new type of way to see yourself. Social theory can help clinicians, again, seeing beyond the symptoms. So looking at those underlying social forces and just also knowing that whatever therapy happens on the one-on-one level, they are, as you know, going to go back into their environment. So that if the environment isn't addressed, and of course you can't always address what's going on in their environment, but at least if there's an awareness of that, then maybe some of those things can shift. It improves outcomes and supports holistic treatment and prevention. We didn't go into all of the research on kind of the reverse engineering of this, where it's not just about understanding the social conditions, but then there's a world of research looking at changes in those social conditions, changes in policy, and how that does make a difference in terms of addiction and prevention. So there's real evidence here. It's not integrated. It is not integrated into addiction treatment, these broader factors. It can also support more culturally responsive care, more equitable care, effective care, because you're integrating these other factors that are affecting addiction. How could it not be helpful if you're addressing these other factors, even if you're just bringing them up? So, final quote is, addiction is not only located in the brain or the individual, it's also embedded in relationships, institutions, and social conditions. So think about that petri dish, what is in it, what it is breeding. And it just gives you that perspective where you're stepping back. All right. These are some references for further reading. And thank you so much. And I will tell you that I am always very open to meet with you if you have questions or comments, collaborations, anything like that, post this presentation. So please don't be shy with that. I love connecting with people, especially because we're just on Zoom. And now I'll check out some of the questions while I have a few more minutes.